Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Ben, and this is the new updated Fesley FDK-800 electric guitar, and this is the new Fesley mini portable guitar amp. Let's get into them. Now before we start, and in complete disclosure, Fesley did give me this guitar and the amp to do a review on. I was not paid, and we've had specific discussions about how the review will be my honest opinion about how I always do these without any input from them. Additionally, my review will be online without them having a chance to see it first, so I commend them for agreeing to that. All right, now let's get into this. So I'm going to talk about the guitar first, we'll talk about all the specs on it, and then I'm going to do a sound test with that. Then I'm going to jump into the amp, we'll do the specs on that and the sound test for that. And afterwards I'll do a pros and cons, my final thoughts kind of thing on both of these products. There are chapter markers below, you can feel free to jump ahead if you don't want to listen to all the specs on this stuff. Now I do want to be clear that the guitar and the amp are two separate products that are not bundled together, at least not as of the time of this review. So this is the updated FDK-800, and now I imagine F stands for Fesley and DK stands for Dinky, as in the Jackson Dinky guitars like this one right here. Now this guitar has been marketed by Fesley on Amazon.com as a beginner guitar, and the price does seem to promote that at just $250 with a complete guitar accessory bundle. The guitar currently has an impressive 4.2 star review out of 5 stars on Amazon.com. The biggest criticism being that it needs a little bit of setup when it shows up, and the fret ends are a little bit rough, but otherwise it generally has pretty positive reviews. Now one review that caught my eye on Amazon.com, the buyer bought the guitar based on some YouTube reviews, and they deduced that the YouTube reviews must have gotten purposely set up guitars for those reviews, and maybe it didn't reflect their experience with the guitar. Well, I just want to clarify that this guitar actually was sent to me from Amazon.com via Fesley's checkbook or whatever. So this would be an accurate representation of the guitar if you were to buy it from Amazon. Now from what I can tell, the FDK-800 has been around for about a year now, but as I said earlier, this is the updated model. So there are a few changes to some of the materials. Some of the aesthetic look is a little bit different, and there's a little bit different of the electronics as well. I'll talk about all that stuff later. Now of course this is the blue finish of the guitar, but there's also purple, black, and sunburst. And yeah, blue, purple, black, and sunburst kind of sound like boring names. They maybe could have put burst on all of them because as you can see here, it is a AAA flamed maple top, and I don't think the title of blue does it justice. Just my opinion, of course. Now let's get into the included accessory bundle. So this is the gig bag here, complete with the Fesley logo on the front. Big fan of lower budget models that come with gig bags. I appreciate having something to protect your guitar. You've also got a decent pocket on the front. This one has the instruction manual inside, but you can also store sheet music, extra strings, snacks, whatever. The backside here has some backpack style straps, and there is a carrying handle on the front as well. Inside, it's pretty bare bones with just a bit of padding in there for protection. Then there's also this included goodie bag. Let's see, we've got an included cable. I'm guessing it's a 10-footer. We've got the tremolo bar as well as some additional wrenches for adjustment. Looks like a guitar strap, a polishing cloth. Then we've got a sanding sponge. Interesting, kind of scares me to be honest. We've got a Fesley tuner, and lastly we've got some Fesley guitar picks. Now something I didn't mention in there is the guitar also comes with these hang tags on it, and this one's got a bunch of little diagrams for different chords, which is pretty helpful, I think. Now as I mentioned, the inclusion of the sanding sponge is a little bit of a concern to me. It seems to tie in directly with the criticism that the fret ends maybe are a little bit rougher than they should be. Also, have you ever had a sanding sponge come with a guitar that you bought? On one hand, I commend them for that. On the other hand, maybe there's something that needs to be done about that before it gets shipped out. Now moving on to the body here, this is a poplar body. This is a 3-piece body. You've got one strip here, one down the middle, and one on this wing over here. Of course, you would never be able to tell that from the front because what you've got here is a AAA flamed maple top. Now that certainly caught my eye, and I couldn't wait to see just how much of a top it was, so I popped out the pickups and did a little investigating, and it turns out it's just a veneer and not really like a slab like you might find on the new Gibson Victory guitars. Now if you're not familiar with what a veneer is, well imagine you take a really nice piece of wood, say like this flamed maple top that you see here, and instead of devoting that thick slab of nice looking maple to one guitar like you would on maybe a Les Paul or the aforementioned Gibson Victory guitar, you instead run it through a deli slicer and you get really thin, I'm talking like 1/10 of an inch or even less, thin slices of really nice looking wood that you can then slap on a multitude of guitars. So it's a really nice way for a budget manufacturer to extend a really nice look to a lot of guitars. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it at all, and honestly, it looks better than it would if it didn't have it. It's a nice looking body. As I mentioned, it's clearly inspired by the Jackson Dinky. I really like the binding on the side there. I think that's a really nice way to class up the look of this guitar. And it actually kind of reminds me a lot of my Godin LG XT, which has a similar color scheme and also a similar binding there, which pretty nice looking. I really like the binding on these kind of guitars. Now let's talk about the carves on this body. There's only a few, but I think they're the important carves that everybody wants on something like this. First one is this rollover right here, so when you're playing, it's just a little bit more comfortable to the touch. And then the second one is this belly carve, which you gotta have a belly carve on a guitar like this, right? And that's kind of it. Otherwise, you're just dealing with a plain slab. Now you do have these nice cutouts here, which give you pretty decent fret access. I kind of wish they would have done maybe a more contoured or modern heel on the backside like you see on the new Squier Contemporary Stratocasters, but you still have plenty of access to get all the way up there to the 24th fret. And speaking of the neck here, let's talk about it. So what we've got here is a all maple neck here. This is a pretty fat C actually. I'll get into the measurements of that in a second. And then the fretboard here, whereas before it used to be a mixed wood composite, now they are using Purple Heart. Now I've never actually used Purple Heart, but apparently it's a dark wood, as you can see, and very hard. It seems to look the part, I think. Now, I'm a big fan of these fretboard inlays here. These are just open circles, and on the camera it might look like they're just white inlay material, but actually up close you can see that it's a pearloid or celluloid type of material that mimics a mother of pearl look, and it's pretty neat looking. It's a very subtle touch, but I actually really like it. And then on the side you've got your white fretboard markers there. Up here at the very top of the guitar we've got a bone nut. According to the specifications sheet that I got, it's actually made of beef bones, in case you wanted to know. Now for some of the measurements on this guitar, for the nut I'm getting a 1.64 inches. On the first fret I'm getting a 0.88, and all the way down here at the 12th fret I'm getting a 0.96. So like I said, it's definitely a fat C neck, but since that's kind of generally what I prefer, I'm a big fan of it. Now the finish on the neck is something that I'm quite impressed with. It's not quite a satin finish at all, and it's not quite a glossy finish. It's kind of right there in the middle, and what I really like about that is it moves very easy without very much stick. So I give them an A+ on the feeling of this neck. Now lastly, at the very top of this guitar, we've got the laminated headstock there. It's a nice look. You can see we've got the Fesley name, and then oddly enough, underneath Fesley it says Deluxe Edition. Now I've noticed this pattern with Fesley online. They seem to have these arbitrary subtitles to a lot of their guitars, like Ghost Series, Crafted Series, Deluxe Edition, that don't really seem to correlate with any subcategory of guitars or other feature set that's referenced on their website. So I don't know if that's something that they're working on or if that's just a buzzword that they put on it. I don't know. Now moving on to the hardware of this guitar, well, I really like this blacked out look. You've got your blacked out knob, switch tip, trem bar, bridge, pickups, strap buttons, jack. Pretty cool stuff. Actually reminds me of the tools that correlate with this part of the guitar, which would be mainly for adjusting your bridge or your saddles, are all black. And then the tools that came with the truss rod, which is chrome, is also a chrome Allen key. I don't know if that's something they did on purpose or just a happy accident, but I'm gonna choose to believe that somebody said, let's color code those just because it'll be something nice. Now going back to the hardware here, yes, we've got pretty decent strap buttons here. They've got some really nice fat, thick edges there, so I think they'll provide a decent amount of security. We've got the black jack plate right next to that. Now moving on to the bridge here, we've got a knife edge tremolo system here, which is a really nice touch on a budget guitar. A lot of times you'll just get the blunt edge tremolo system. Now if you're not familiar with this type of tremolo, it's something that Paul Reed Smith came up with, and it's pretty much been copied by every single manufacturer since. And what it is the trem plate here has a knife edge to it. So if you were to use your trem bar forward or backwards, when it returns because of the tension, the knife edge tends to slide along this angled screw and return it to the place where it started at least with more accuracy than what you generally get on a flat, blunt edge bridge. Now additionally, we've got, of course, 6 different saddles for your 6 different strings. Pretty easy to adjust. You've got the 2 different screws on each side to adjust the angle as well as the height on each one of these saddles. Now these saddles also have rounded edges, so if you're playing the trem bar forward or backward, the string has a tendency to roll over it as opposed to going over a 90-degree angle and getting snagged. Now the trem bar itself is a threaded type there. I did end up throwing in one of those Fender trem arm springs just to keep the arm from being a little too flippy floppy. Now let's flip the guitar over and check out the cavity here for the tremolo system. It looks like we've got a small zinc trem block in here and then the normal 3-spring compensation. Nothing crazy or unusual in there. Now let's flip around the front and check out these pickups. We've got a humbucker in the bridge and a single coil in the middle and the neck, so an HSS configuration. Now when it comes to the switching on this guitar, that is something that they've changed on the updated FDK model. So originally you had your bridge, which was your humbucker. Then your position 2 was the top coil and the middle pickup. Your middle was your middle. And then of course 4 was the middle and neck, and lastly was your neck pickup. Well, they've done away with the auto split feature on this guitar. So now what you've got is number 1 is your bridge, number 2 is the entire humbucker and middle pickup. Then number 3 is your middle pickup, 4 is your middle and neck, and lastly 5 is just the neck pickup. When it comes to these controls here, you've got a master volume, and then this tone here actually affects either the neck or the middle position, and this tone here is just for the humbucker. Now let's flip this around and look inside the cavity and see what we've got going on in there. Looks like we've got some dime-sized pots in there. These are 500K tone pots with a couple of green 0.047 Mylar capacitors in there. Not really a bad little setup for this budget guitar. Let's take some readings on these pickups here, and it looks like what we're getting for the bridge pickup is a 8.65 for the humbucker. In the middle, I'm getting a 4.81, and at the neck, I'm getting a 4.56. Now when I put it in the number 2 position, which is the humbucker and the middle pickup, I'm getting a 3.11. And lastly, position 4, which is the middle and the neck pickup, I'm getting a 2.35. So overall, not very hot pickups. I guess the sound will speak for itself. I did take out the pickups to try and see if I could get any information on them. And of course, the only thing I saw was on the humbucker, we had the all too familiar B stamp for bridge. Now moving on past the electronics, let's get to the frets here. Now this guitar has 24 frets. I'm reading a height of about 50 thousandths on these frets here. Now let's check out the fret ends and see what we've got here. This is some wax paper. I'm going to rub it along the bottom side of the fretboard here, and tears. Well, I guess that explains the sanding sponge. Now, I don't like rough fret edges. I don't really know anybody that actually seeks those out. So I'll give them kudos for giving you the tool to make that right. But I do think that's indicative of a larger problem that hopefully they can take care of, because if they have the forethought to give you this, that means this must be a pretty common thing, and maybe they need to have some sort of QC or something, maybe even stateside when these guitars arrive here, to take care of that if it is something like fret sprout. Who knows? Anyway, moving on from there, we get to our truss rod, which is buried in a hole at the top of the neck here, just like you would find on a Fender guitar or any other guitar that's of this style and doesn't have a truss rod cover. Now, in my experience, I actually had a little bit of trouble getting the adjustment tool in there because the hole that is bored into the headstock there that then goes to the truss rod was just a little bit too tight to actually get that wrench easily in there. So I had to force it in there, and unfortunately, it did scratch the laminate just a little bit inside of that hole. It's not a big deal, but it was certainly more frustrating than I have had in a while adjusting a truss rod. And I also don't know if that's a problem that's unique to this guitar or if a lot of these FDK-800s have that same issue. If you have one of these, I'd be curious to know myself. Now, after I eventually got the truss rod adjustment tool in there, the truss rod worked just fine, and I was able to apply a little bit of a turn to get this neck how I want it for my playing. Now moving up from there, we get to a couple string trees for the first 4 strings, the E, B, G, and D. And then lastly, we flip the guitar around, and we've got a couple things over here. First, I'd like to point out the Fesley branded tuners. They actually feel really good. These are coming in at an 18:1 ratio, which I quite like. And then just down from there, we get to the neck plate, which is just a solid metal black plate. I'm going to do a sound test for this guitar. I will put all of my settings right here on the side so you can see exactly what I'm doing and follow along if you would like to. I have restrung this guitar with my preferred brand of strings, which is String Joy Broadway strings. Some of my favorite strings, I think you should check them out. I've got a custom set 9.5 to 42s, which is pretty much what I string every guitar with. Now, if you haven't seen one of my sound tests before, everything goes into a twin reverb, and if it's clean, it's just the amplifier. If it's a little distorted, I'm using a Wampler Tumnus pedal, and if it's really hard driving distortion, then I'm using the Wampler Tumnus into a tube screamer. I will indicate all of that on the screen so you can follow along with that as well. And occasionally I'll add reverb or delay in my DAW as I see fit. Now let's get into this sound test. Well, there you go. That is the sound test on the guitar. Now let's get into the Fesley Mini Guitar Portable Amp. So this is the Fesley FGA electric guitar amp. It retails for about 50 bucks. It's pretty small, as you can see, and it weighs about 1.5 pounds. Dimension-wise, it's about 6 inches by just under 4 inches. Certainly very tiny. Actually, I wonder, maybe you could fit this in the gig bag. Let's see. Seems to fit. Now, one of the special features about this amp is, of course, that it's got a built-in lithium-ion battery, and it takes about 3 hours to get a full charge. That was my experience as well. Now, I did want to see how long this battery would last because I could not find any information on that, and I have to admit it was a pretty lengthy test there because I plugged it up to my computer on a speaker output, plugged it into there, which I know isn't a guitar, but I didn't want to sit there and play for 5 hours straight. And I just hit play on an 8-hour iTunes playlist. I was shocked that at the end of that playlist, it was still going, so then I reset it. And truth be told, I actually got just shy of 15 hours of playtime out of this. Now, of course, I had the volume at about halfway, and I would come in every once in a while and add the distortion, take the distortion off, mess around with the tones, and your length of time will vary based on how loud you've got it. And not to mention, batteries will degrade over time, of course, but even if you're getting half that amount of time, we'll say 7 hours, 7.5 hours of playtime, that's pretty good for a small practice amp that really weighs nothing, right? Now, before we get to some of the features on the front of this amp, let's take a look at the back side here. So what we've got is your DC 5-volt USB-C charging port there. You've also got a headphone out and an auxiliary in. Now, flipping this thing around, first up, we've got our 1/4-inch input jack there. We've got a clean drive button. We've got a volume for your guitar. We've got your tone knob there, which will cycle between dark or very bright. We've got a gain setting. And lastly, a Bluetooth auxiliary volume, which will adjust the volume of maybe you've got your aux in or your Bluetooth streaming music, which is something you can do with this amp, which is pretty cool. And that's kind of it. It's a basic set of features there. So let's do a sound test. I will put a microphone up to this thing and record it right into my DAW here. I'm using a Scarlett into Studio One, and it'll just be the sounds of this amp. I'm not going to add any reverb or anything, and we'll go from there and see what we think of the Fesley portable guitar amp. Now, I'm always skeptical when a company gives a product for free for somebody to review, and honestly, you should be too. That's why I make it a point of mentioning any concerns that I have or issues that I have as I'm going through my review. So let's talk about the pros and the cons of this guitar first. And I say that with the idea that I assume everybody's going to put 15 to 20 minutes into each guitar that they get brand new, whether it's changing strings or adjusting the saddle heights or maybe even messing with the truss rod. So that being said, let's talk about the cons of the guitar first. Well, I obviously mentioned the fret ends, and that is kind of a bit of a bummer, I think. Now, if you're an experienced guitar player or messing with your guitars, I don't think it's a big deal for somebody like me, but if this was my first guitar, I think I would probably be afraid to even attempt to sand those down. So I don't know if that's indicative of a quality control issue at the factory, or if it is indeed fret sprouts, like people are saying maybe that's what it is from traveling across the world. Either way, I think it's something that Fesley does need to look into more. Moving on from that, let's talk about this truss rod issue here. Now, getting my truss rod adjustment tool in there was a little bit of a ordeal. Nothing crazy, I just kind of forced it in there, but it did end up scratching the inner laminate just a little bit. To a lot of people, that might not matter much, but for me, I'm one of those people that's a little neurotic, so when I have something that's brand new, I try to keep it looking brand new as long as possible. And then when the inevitable happens, like I drop a remote on it and I leave a little tiny dent, I just sit there and think about it for days and weeks. And every time I look at it, it's like it's tarnished forever. I have this Les Paul Standard. It was pristine. Something similar happened and it has the tiniest dent on the face of it now. And I'm just angry with myself because I knew it was my fault. And I know there's a lot of other neurotic guitarists out there. So it doesn't matter to me if it's a $3,000 Les Paul or a $250 Fesley guitar. That's just something that's going to bother me. Another con that I haven't mentioned is the tuning stability when I use the trem bar. I did see one review that had a similar issue with it, and I didn't really think too much of it because nobody else mentioned it, but it does seem like when I do any sort of bending on there, my tuning gets a little jacked up. Now, I don't know if that's because the strings are getting caught maybe on the string trees, or maybe I need to put more lubrication or cleaning up of the nut there, or perhaps it's even something down here on the bridge. I haven't really investigated it too much yet, so I didn't use the trem bar too much. But that could definitely be something that discourages a new player. So I need to look into that more, and maybe I'll report back when I figure out what that is. Now for the pros of this guitar, it's a really nice looking guitar with some pretty decent sounding pickups. Are they the best pickups I've ever played? No, of course not. But let's say this is one of your first guitars, your beginner guitar, and you really make this guitar your machine. It's easy enough to swap them out later on down the line for something that's a little bit better. I also like this neck. I know it's a bit of a personal preference, but the thicker C neck is just something that fits in my hand a lot better. It might be too thick for some new beginner guitarists, but for me, I think it's A+. Now, after I sanded down the fret ends, the guitar also played really nice, but I realized that might be a moot point. It does come with a pretty stacked accessory package. You've got your gig bag, you've got your tuner, you've got your straps, you've got a guitar cable, you've got guitar picks, you've got the old fretboard sponge there. Pretty nice setup, so it's hard to really fault that. Now, considering all these pros and cons, I do think I would agree with most reviewers and say that I think the guitar is a really decent value, especially when you factor in the pretty stacked accessory package there. I've certainly played $300 guitars, $500 guitars that had more negative check boxes also. Now, moving on to this amp here, it is a solid little practice amp, and I do like how tiny it is. It is even tinier than the Spark Mini that I have. I do think $50 is a bit expensive for what this amp does offer. I've seen similar offerings that were around 35 bucks, 40 bucks. Honestly, they kind of look the same. It might be the same housing, just with a different name on it. Now, that being said, I was very impressed with the battery life of this thing. I mean, 15, 16 hours of playing is certainly more than I would ever do in one sitting. It does have, of course, very limited tonal options and tonal range because you've got, I don't even know what's in there, maybe a couple 2-inch speakers. It can't be anything bigger than that. So you can imagine that that's the sound you're going to get out of it. You're certainly not going to be playing this amp in a room with a full drum set. But for taking this thing on the road and maybe practicing in a hotel room, or maybe you're taking it to school, maybe you're taking it to your job and doing it at lunch, yeah, it's fine for that. So overall, not having played with any Fesley products before, I'm pretty impressed. I'm very curious to see what they come out with in the future. Have any of you guys played with any of this stuff before? I'd be very curious to know what you guys think of all this stuff, whether it's something you own or just from watching this review. I'd like to give a big thanks to Fesley again for sending these products for me to review and allowing me to do an open and honest look at both of these products. So big props to them for that. I also promised them that I would put the links in the description below at the end of my video, so you have a chance to take all this information, digest it as you will, and do with it as you want. Now, if you like content like this, consider clicking the like button, or better yet, consider subscribing. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I will talk to you next time.